Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Chop It Up Sports. We're going to have a pretty low-key episode for you guys today as the holiday season approaches. We are recording this on Christmas Eve. We got a special guest, best friend of mine on the pod today, Hunter Fullerton. Hunter, thanks for coming on, man.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to get into some college football today, as usual, in this time of the year. First round of the college football playoff just wrapped up. The first time we've had this first round in the new 12-team format. And to be honest, it was kind of a dud. No real games were really competitive. Clemson, Texas was close for a little bit, but outside of that, it was pretty much a blowout on all four fronts this weekend, which is pretty disappointing, but I think we are going to see some better ball as this tournament continues. Hunter, before we get into anything, I just want to start off by talking about whether or not the committee got it right, especially, when this rankings came out for the teams that got in, SMU, Clemson, and some of those teams on the bubble. The argument was that they didn't have the bad losses as much as teams like Alabama and Ole Miss had, where Alabama had these massive wins over teams like Georgia and South Carolina, but they also had bad losses, to teams like Kentucky and Vanderbilt and just various teams that are in that lower level of the SEC. So I just want to ask you, did the committee get it right with who they got in? Do you think that there's certain teams that got left out that should have been put in?
Yeah, well, I think if we're looking at it, from the standpoint as we're trying to get the 12 best teams in the playoff, I think definitely, there's definitely some arguments that some teams left out, like Alabama, possibly even Miami, could have slipped in over like a team like SMU. Um, Obviously, Clemson was the ACC champ, but yeah, definitely there's an argument there. Uh, in terms of being fair, I'm not really sure. You know, three losses compared to one for SMU, compared to Alabama. That's a tough argument to make. Obviously, the strength of schedule, plays into it. But if we're looking at the 12 best teams, yeah, definitely the 12 best teams aren't in this playoff right now. Um, but I'm not really sure, the adjustments we need to make in order to, have a better output on this first weekend.
So if you're the committee next year and say it comes down to, let's say we have Ole Miss and a mediocre Big Ten team. Well, I guess not mediocre, but like a mid-level Big Ten team, like an Indiana or a team like that emerges next year, and say they have one loss to a top 10 team, but then you have an Ole Miss squad who has two losses to mediocre SEC teams, maybe like a 7-5 or 6-6 team, similar to the squads they lost to this year in Florida and Kentucky. Who do you go with after looking at the results this year? Do you go with the Big Ten team who might have more wins, but over lesser opponents rather than an SEC squad who has more losses to also not as great opponents, but may have a couple more key wins there in the top 10 or top 15?
Yeah, I think there should be more of an emphasis on strength of schedule, but I think it shouldn't be, necessarily the dominant factor, right? So if they that three-loss team has a stacked schedule, they should they should probably make it in, depending on what their losses look like. That being said, if the strength of schedule isn't, that there isn't that large of a discrepancy, then I say then we turn to the team with the more wins. So it's a tough choice. I think the committee, got it wrong this year, but it wasn't, they weren't too far off.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think like the regular season has to have value. Like it's not Indiana's fault that they won all their games by double digits, despite the fact that they play unranked teams and then got blown out by Ohio State. There's a lot of really good teams this year that would go into the shoe and get blown out. And we saw that this weekend with Tennessee, who was a legit SEC contender. So the regular season has to have value. You have to honor those teams that had success and won the games that they were supposed to in the regular season. But at the same time, you also have to be able to credit teams who may have a couple more bumps and bruises along the way because they went through death row in their power conference rather than a team who kind of got lucky with an easier strength of schedule. And that's something that I think is really interesting. When you look at the SEC and you look at the Big Ten, obviously these conferences have almost doubled in size over the last couple of years. And so weirdly enough, you run into these teams who, despite being in a mega conference with 15 to 20 teams, there's a chance that when you have teams like Indiana and they're playing, the bottom end of that conference all year long, that when you run into an Ohio State or a Notre Dame, you really just get out physical and you just get dominated for 4 quarters. But because Indiana didn't have as many opportunities to prove that they weren't the team that people thought they were, then the committee, there's no real reasoning for them to know that Indiana's not the team that they might have thought they were. So I think it just puts them in a tough spot. Like for me, when I look at that, SMU and Clemson both getting in, I think that's a little skeptical. I know you can't necessarily discredit SMU for making their conference championship game, but I don't think you can sit there and tell me that Alabama wouldn't have played Penn State closer, or even Miami, who didn't make the ACC championship game. I think they still make that more competitive. But at the same time, SMU did what they were supposed to do. Like they lost one game to a conference opponent, and that was in their conference championship game. And then obviously the loss to BYU, who is I mean, that's a pretty good loss just in terms of who some of the other teams in that top 12 has lost to. So let's get into the playoff games that we saw this week. In the first one, Indiana went to Notre Dame, got walloped by the Catholics there. South Bend was rocking. That place was on fire. What did you see there down in South Bend?
Yeah, I think that was just a more complete team matched up against a team with, a couple playmakers that made bad teams look bad throughout the regular season. But at the end of the day, Notre Dame's a more complete team. They're bigger up front, more complete defense, and that team's going to win a game 9 out of 10 times. Um, so I think, Indiana had a great year. They had some great playmakers, but in terms of, a team that's big enough, physical enough to compete in the college football playoffs. I don't think they were that, and Notre Dame exposed them this weekend, just like Ohio State did earlier in the year. So, I mean, what were we really expecting uh, out of Indiana? You know, when we look at their matchups when they play these big physical teams, this outcome has already happened once this year, so I'm not too surprised.
Looking back on it, I definitely thought that Notre Dame was easily the favorite. I don't know why I didn't pick them coming into this game. I thought that Indiana, their offense had been explosive. They had showed that they had been the best run defense in the country statistically. And about two drives into the game, you could see that all those statistics were out the window completely. Notre Dame, they bust out the 98-yard rushing touchdown against a team that, like I said, statistically was supposed to be the best rushing defense in the country. And then on their second drive, they gash open, essentially a 100-yard run for a touchdown. And it was pretty much downhill from there for the Hoosiers. I think, this game really showed that you can have talent on the outside. You can win games by a lot of margins or by big margins and have an explosive offense. But when it comes down to playoff football and it's about matchups, the team that is going to be effective running the ball and is going to win in the trenches is going to win the game a majority of the time. Like you said, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be the team that wins in the trenches, can protect the quarterback and open up holes for the running game. And Notre Dame was able to do that. I think they do have quite potentially the best backfield in college football between Jeremiah Love and Riley Leonard and some of the other backs that they feature. I know Ohio State has a great run game as well, but I think because Riley Leonard can use his legs effectively, and now I know we both agree he doesn't have the best arm we've ever seen, but I think because he has this dual threat ability on his leg with his legs, I think that opens up a new dimension for this Notre Dame or offense. I think it'll be really interesting to see how they match up against Georgia because Georgia's defense is legit. We've seen their rush completely dominate offenses. We saw that in Texas twice, once in Austin, and then the other time in the SEC championship game. And so, as good as Notre Dame looked against Indiana, I think it might be more about how miserable Indiana was and really how fraudulent this team was, despite the fact that they had 11 wins and maybe their best season in program history.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, moving forward, Notre Dame's not going to be able to rely on Riley Leonard's arm. So I think it all comes down to staying ahead of the sticks against Georgia, which is extremely difficult to do, and I honestly don't expect them to. Uh, but if they can, they have a shot. But I think if Riley Leonard's dropping back to pass, uh, you know, multiple times in a drive, multiple on multiple third downs, I don't see a way that Notre Dame pulls out a win next week.
Let's dive into that game a little bit more. Going to be in the Sugar Bowl where Notre Dame's going to be taking on Georgia there down in New Orleans. It was announced earlier this week, Carson Beck, he's done for the year. So that brings in Gunnar Stockton. We saw him a little bit in the SEC championship game, maybe a little bit more mobile than Beck. The arm talent, I don't really think is comparable. And I know Beck's been off this season, but I just don't think that, his backup quarterback is going to come in and light it up. Like we've seen in years past where a team will bring in, like a Tua or a quarterback of that caliber who just comes in and lights up the scoreboard. I think this one's going to be a grudge match. I think it's going to be a really ugly game just because of both teams having mediocre quarterback play at best. And then with how strong their defensive lines are, I think it's going to be hard for both teams to run the ball, and I favor Georgia in this one just because of the fact that I think if the game's going to come down to who's going to win in the trenches and who's going to run the ball more effectively, I have a hard time seeing Georgia and Kirby Smart lose in that category. And it kind of seems like you're on the same page with that one. Does that sound right?
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I mean, we're looking at last week, or sorry, excuse me, a couple weeks ago against the Longhorns. Georgia only gives up 31 yards, and that's a good rushing attack uh, that the Longhorns present, and Georgia's only allowing 31 yards. So I think that Notre Dame, they have a chance if they get it going. I just don't see it happening. I think Georgia will run the ball more effectively, and then Kirby Smart will put Gunnar Stockton into positions to make a few plays when they need it, and that's all they're going to need probably. Uh, and so I think Georgia, like I agree, it'll be a grudge match, but I think Georgia probably pulls this one out unless it's a 10 to 13, 13 to 16 type of game. Um, Anything above 20 points, I don't see any way Notre Dame wins this.
Let's go over to Happy Valley for a little bit. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this game. It was a blowout. It was ugly. I didn't even catch the first quarter, and so by the time I turned the TV on, this game was over. Penn State dominates SMU. SMU, like I said, had a strong argument to be into the playoff, had some solid losses, but at the end of the day, I don't really think that they're better than an Alabama or even Miami. I think there's a number of teams that you could have put into SMU or could have put in over SMU rather, but at the end of the day, they sneak in, they go to Happy Valley, they get dominated. SMU quarterback Kevin Jennings couldn't have looked worse. I mean, through two pick sixes that looked like he was a 5 year old playing like Madden when you just beat up on your little cousin at Thanksgiving. I mean, those throws were awful. I don't know what he was looking at in the defense. I don't know if he was seeing double. Just some awful plays there by the quarterback. And then at that point, they're already behind the eight ball. Just with how effective Penn State is with chewing up the clock in their running game. There's no chance for SMU. But going forward for Penn State, they're going to have an interesting matchup with Boise. I know they looked dominant in this one. I think this was more of SMU just kind of pooping the bed more than Penn State coming in here and manhandling them. It's going to be an interesting matchup in the Fiesta Bowl. What do you make of all this? Just between Penn State dominating at home and then having to go on the road, essentially across the country, to go take on Boise in the Fiesta Bowl.
Yeah, I think Penn State did what they've been doing all year, displaying that they're a complete team, right? They play on both sides of the ball. Drew Allar's, you know, pretty good at holding it down. Their rushing attack's good, and then that defense is, great, one of the top defenses in the country. And so moving forward, I think, Boise State presents a more of a challenge than SMU personally. I think Boise State, they're a little bit more dynamic on offense. Mudson's been, he's had a good year passing the ball, and then obviously they have, Ashton Genty, who, some believe should have been the Heisman. So I think Boise
Should have.
State presents more of a challenge, but Penn State's a complete team. They're big, they're physical, they play on both sides of the ball. Uh, so it's going to be an uphill battle for Boise State, who I think has a slim shot, but it definitely would be an upset if they find a way to pull it out. So.
I talked about it a little bit on the last show. There's something that tells me that Genty is just so pissed that he didn't win this Heisman. I mean, he's going to break Barry Sanders' rushing record most likely. He won the fan vote. For all you political people out there, it's essentially like winning the popular vote, but you don't win the election. Um, some of our listeners might know a thing or two about that. But I just think that Genty is going to have a legacy game. I think that Boise State in the Fiesta Bowl, that's been their home away from home in the past. And there's just something that tells me I just have a gut feeling they're going to be able to make some noise in this game. Now, does that mean that they're going to win it? Maybe not. I picked them to win this game. I'm confident in Genty. I just think it doesn't matter what defense he's getting matched up against. I think he's going to find a way to run the ball. They use a good job, or they do a good job using him in a variety of settings, whether it's running to the inside, outside the tackles, even in the passing game. So I think that'll be a really fun matchup to watch in the Fiesta Bowl. Let's go down to Texas. This was maybe the most competitive game of the weekend, which really says something because Texas still won by double digits. Clemson gave them a run for their money. It looked like they're in the second half. They're going to be able to get it down to a one possession game. Unfortunately, Clemson, turns it over on downs inside the 5 yard line. That Texas run defense came up stout on the goal line. The big vocal point in this game was the Texas run game. I think between Trey Wisner and Jaden Blue, it was just too much for the Clemson defense. And we saw that throughout the year with Clemson's run D. They just couldn't really stop anything. And so for Texas to run all over them wasn't really a shock. I just think the biggest surprise is, we really haven't seen that Texas running game take off the way they did against Clemson, especially on that big of a stage. I do have some concerns with the Longhorns. I want to get into that in a second. But what did you take away from this one?
Yeah, I think I had a lot of similar takeaways. That run game for Texas looked really good. I think Sarkisian puts them good packages, right? Mixes things up, throws different looks at teams, and that allows them to be pretty dynamic in the run game. Quinn Ewers played like Quinn Ewers, just pretty you know slightly above mediocre. Did what he needed to do, got a dub, and so if they continue to do this moving forward, I don't see a way they don't pick up a win next week, and then who knows what happens when they make it to the semis.
Quinn Ewers, pretty mediocre performance. He hasn't looked the same down the stretch in the second half of the season. This was a guy coming into college that was the highest ranked recruit ever. And that's saying something considering the guys that we've seen in college football. Do you think it's the injuries? Do you think it's the system? Or do you think it's simply the fact that maybe he's just not as good as people made him out to be?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it's just the fact that maybe he's not as good as people made him out to be. He's had some big games, but outside of that, he's consistently performed like I said, slightly above mediocre. He often does what the team needs, but I don't think, he's had a couple big games where he put the ball in his hand and he makes something happen. But a couple games out of, 3 years as the starting quarterback, obviously there's injuries in there, mixed in there, but, he hasn't consistently proven that he's, one of the top tier guys or a Heisman contender. And so I think that maybe just is who Quinn Ewers is. You know,
Yeah, I agree with you there. And the interesting part is that I was really high on Texas all year long. I thought that Ewers, this was going to be his breakout year. He's been around, he's an experienced vet. And I think it's just kind of a combination of a lot of things. I think having Arch Manning right behind him, breathing down his neck all season probably doesn't help. I think that probably leads to Ewers being a little bit more tight in crunch time situations, just because having that thought in your head where if I mess up or I make this throw or if I turn the ball over, my leash is short because the guy right behind me is one of the most touted recruits that we've ever seen. Obviously we know the relation to Peyton Eli. I think that doesn't help. And then obviously the injuries that he suffered throughout the year. He just looks banged up. He looks tight on his throws. His mechanics don't look the same from what we've seen when he's healthy and he's slinging the ball all around the field. And this is something I saw on the broadcast when they were talking about it. He just doesn't have the same zip on the ball that he used to. Even last year, it looked like he was finding guys downfield, whether it was Xavier Worthy or some of his other weapons. And this year, it doesn't look like he has that same accuracy on deep ball throws, even stuff underneath. Couple fourth down conversions here against Clemson where he's throwing the ball behind guys. He's not leading them in stride. And so I think it just sucks to see as a fan of college football. I was really excited for Ewers to come in. I still think he's a solid quarterback, and I think we could see Texas make a run if he turns it around. I just don't think he's, the first overall pick or the first round quarterback that we all thought he was going to be when he came into college football. Let's take it down to Columbus. This game was terrible. I thought it was going to be the best game of the weekend. Thought it was going to be super competitive. Couldn't have been more wrong with that one. Ohio State whomps Tennessee at home at the shoe. I think this was a Ohio State team that was really just pissed off, to say the least, coming off the Michigan loss. And for 2 weeks, all I hear about is Ryan Day needs to be fired. Ohio State isn't what they thought they were. This whole program needs a shift. They can't beat Michigan, all these things. And so I think just hearing that from the media for 2 weeks, I mean, people were calling the shoe Neyland North for a week leading up to the game because of how many Tennessee fans were trying to essentially take over the stadium. And so from Ohio State to come in and just beat the crap out of Tennessee, I think that's a statement. I think they showed people that, hey, we're not done yet. We're still a national championship caliber team. I think as of now, they're probably my favorite to win the title, and that's why I picked them to win this whole thing. What do you see from the Buckeyes here at home?
yeah, I think Ohio State gave us every reason to believe that this was going to be a close game after a devastating loss to Michigan, and then a close loss to Oregon, obviously, earlier in the year. We had every reason to believe that this was going to be a close game, but I think this Ohio State team, I agree, they were played pissed off, and I think honestly, I don't see a way that anybody beats the team that we saw uh, on Saturday. So Ohio State looked really good. Uh, the question is whether they can keep this up, throughout the playoffs. It'd be a shame to sort of have your best game the first during the first week, but yeah, I think that's one of the best performances we've seen all season, if not the best performance from a single team we've seen all season. They made Tennessee look like nobody. I mean, they looked like a bottom level Big Ten team that Ohio State has been facing all year. So
I know you just said it'd be a shame if that was the best game Ohio State played in this tournament, but you're also a diehard Oregon Ducks fan. We talked about it last time you were on the show. So there's part of me that believes that you'd actually be really happy if that's the best game that Ohio State plays in this tournament. Rose Bowl's on New Year's Day, taking on the Ducks. They've faced each other a million times in the Rose Bowl. Oregon's gotten Ohio State the last two times. Once this year, obviously in Eugene, and then back in Columbus a few years ago before they were in the same conference. What are you expecting here in the Rose Bowl? Because I think that whoever wins this game is going to win the national championship. And I know that's pretty premature to say, but I just think looking across this bracket with how consistent some of these teams have looked, I know we have Boise State and Arizona State getting buys as, you know, conference champions in lesser conferences, you could say. And so I think these are the two real front runners in this bracket. Oddly enough, they're playing each other in the second round. What do you make here in the Rose Bowl?
I do agree with your statement that, whoever wins this game might come away with a national championship. It's sort of a shame, that both these teams will continue to have a tough path as they, strive towards the national championship. It's a shame that you can make the argument possibly the three best teams are on this side of the bracket, with, Gunnar Stockton being the starting quarterback for Georgia. Anyway, I think this game will come down to big plays. I think Ohio State overall, I'll give them credit. They probably have a better, more complete defense than Oregon, right? Um, so Oregon's going to need to lean on a couple big plays throughout the game. Um, if they make those happen, uh, you know, I think it's going to be a really close game. Obviously, Ohio State can lay an egg. They've shown us that. But so can Oregon, right? With a close 16-13 dub late in the season against Wisconsin. So I think it's going to come down to big plays. I expect both defenses to show up, play relatively well. Uh, you know, I don't think anybody's going to shut out the other opponent, but I think both offenses will get in rhythm. Both quarterbacks will play well. Uh, so I think at the end of the day, it's going to come down to, who has a couple big plays down the stretch when they need them.
Can we get a score prediction?
Whew, that's tough. I think it's going to be a similar game. We're going to be looking in the low 30s, uh, maybe even a 34-31 win for the Ducks.
34-31 for the Ducks. There you have it. Terrible pick. I think Ohio State's going to beat the brakes out of them. Not actually. I think it's going to be a really good game. I'm excited to see how it goes down there. I'm going to be in Southern Cali, so hoping to find a good spot to watch the game down there in Pasadena. So like we said, we're down to 8 teams now in this playoff. National championship still 2 rounds away. We got about a month until we see the kickoff down there in Atlanta. At this point, who do you expect to see at that game?
In the national championship. Well, with the news with Carson Beck, that sort of throws off that bottom half of the bracket for me. So that lower half's going to be a tough choice. I think if Gunnar Stockton can play, you know, as good as he needs to be, if Kirby Smart can put him in successful situations, I still think Georgia finds a way to make it to the national championship. Um, if it's not Georgia, I got to go with Penn State. They're probably more complete than Notre Dame. Just have a more dynamic offense. I think if they match up against Notre Dame, uh, both defenses will show out. But then at the end of the day, uh, you know, Riley Leonard's going to have to make a couple plays against a Penn State offense, or to compete with a Penn State offense that's going to put up points against this Notre Dame defense. So I think Georgia finds a way to the national championship. If not, it'll be Penn State on that lower half. And then, like I said, I like you said, I think it's the winner of this game makes it all the way on this top half of the bracket. Obviously, Texas is good; they're going to pose challenges, but um, at the end of the day, I think these offenses from Ohio State and Oregon have been more dynamic than Texas. They've played in a couple big games and played better than Texas has. So I think the winner of this game makes it to the Natty to face Georgia.
Last question I'm going to have you here before we let you go. If you're putting money on it, you're in Vegas, you're betting on the college football playoff. Are you betting that the national championship is going to be some sort of rematch between two Big Ten teams, whether it's Oregon, Penn State, or Ohio State, Penn State? Or do you think that we'll see a team from a different conference kind of spoil that?
Well, I think like I said, I still have faith in Georgia. I have faith in Kirby Smart. So I'm not sure I'm putting a lot of money on a Big Ten matchup. Um, I think Kirby Smart will put, his quarterback in a position to succeed. And then from that point, they have the best defense when they're rolling, they have the best defense. Um, their offense, they have a solid run game. So as long as their quarterback can do what they need to do, I think they make it all the way to the Natty. So
I'm right there with you. Well, that is going to wrap it up for today's episode of Chop It Up. We want to wish you guys a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays wherever you're watching this. As the playoffs continue, we might try and do a little live stream where Hunter and I are watching the games live and have you guys tap into the show for a little bit on Instagram or wherever we're streaming. Have you guys comment and just come watch some ball with us and really just come talk some football as the college football season winds down. We'll probably feature Hunter more on the show as we get into March Madness and postseason NBA. That's in a long ways from now, but we'll see him a lot more. Hunter, thanks for coming on, man. We really appreciate your time.
thanks for having me. It's fun. Yeah, thanks for having me.